So it looks like this mic is working, which is a signal to me that we can officially get going. So thank you to everybody who is here, and welcome to the last of a three-part colloquium series that we've been having over the course of this academic year. The series was on the topic, or has been, on the topic of crises, and this all got kicked off back in the fall of last year when we were brainstorming on a number of interesting content areas to bring before the TFN and Tufts and Fletcher friends and family audience. And it seemed like one issue that we seemed to have an abundance of was crises. And we said, why don't we have an ongoing conversation on crises and reflect on not only what kinds of crises are there, but also what are the underlying drivers of these crises, and then having kind of decoded them a little bit, transition to the upside of crises, as in what kinds of innovation and creative opportunities the crises might present. So we split up this big messy problem into three kinds of crises: geopolitical, financial, and resource crises. And of course, we were concerned that by the time we have each one of these events, the crises might resolve themselves and we might have nothing to talk about. And I'm once again happy to announce that we have a lot to talk about. And our last two sessions, both of which were in New York, were enormously stimulating. And if I were to kind of boil down the conclusions, not that there were any conclusions as in, here's what we need to, start doing Monday morning, but really here are the kinds of things that we need to keep in our minds as we kind of go forward. The conclusion was that, yes, there is an underlying crisis at play. However, each of those crises, whether it was from a geopolitical front or from on the financial front, was a platform for creativity. And so let's see what our resource experts today have to say on that topic. And today we have, I must say, an absolutely stunning array of talent from across the university. We have Peter Walker to my immediate left, who I think the label you were supposed to wear was food. Okay. But then Peter is not just a food expert, he's an expert on disasters. He's I guess
what he means is I am a disaster.
So Peter can tell us a lot about nutrition, food, and the human condition, the crisis in the human condition in general. And Peter has a long resume, as do each one of our panelists. And if I were to read each one's biographies, we'll be here the entire night. So I'm not going to do that. Peter directs the Feinstein International Center, and the last time I spoke with him, he was in Dar es Salaam, which was just last week. And every other week, he seems to be in a different corner of the world. So we're very glad to have him in our little corner right here in Boston. Right next to Peter is Rich Vogel, who is our expert on water and directs the Water System Science Society program here at Fletcher. And I guess you are the hydrologist in town. And I read in an interview, Rich, that you did with the Atlantic magazine, that your favorite pastime, other than listening to the sound of water, is listening to the music of the Beverly Hillbillies.
Oh, no.
Maybe we might check up on your latest musical tastes once we're done with discussing water crises. And finally, and last, and as always not least, Kelly Sims Gallagher, who is associate professor at the Fletcher School and is our resident expert on energy and the environment. And she's also a senior associate at the Belfer Center at Harvard University. And Kelly is our expert on fuel and alternatives to fuel and the environment. So with that array of expertise, we'll have a lot to talk about. My suggestion is that we kick off a conversation here, and then I'll open it up to the audience, and feel free to direct your questions to the experts. And if you have a specific person that you would want to direct your question to, please do that. And when you ask your question, please introduce yourself so that we can contextualize your question. Let me lead off with Rich. And as I was reflecting on the previous symposia, the message seemed to be that depending on how you look at it, the glass is half full, if not half empty. And seems quite appropriate to ask the water person that question. Is there a water crisis, Rich, in the world?
Yes.
Okay. Why?
Well, if in excess of 2 billion people not having access to clean water, if having almost 3 billion people lacking adequate sanitation, if over 2 million children every year dying from mostly diarrhea, but other forms of waterborne disease. If those aren't a crisis, then I don't know what it is. I suppose the real crisis in the world around water really relates to the humanitarian issues around water. There are chronic water shortages throughout some of the semi-arid and arid regions of the world. They're expected to increase mostly due to urbanization, but also due to climate change, and you see that in most of the urbanizing areas. There are you often think of water as being renewable, but in fact, it behaves like a non-renewable resource in many parts of the world, in places where they're drawing fossil aquifers, where they're not recharging the water at the rate at which they're withdrawing it, and as a result, there's land subsidence, and it's just simply unsustainable. I mean, there are water stresses, water stresses are tremendously variable in space and time. And even here in New England, we have water stress. In Massachusetts, we have a dry river in Ipswich River in September. I mean, this is one of the most stressed basins in the country, and yet, of course, we don't think of ourselves as stressed here. And the stresses are, pale compared to the earlier stresses the more humanitarian stresses I mentioned earlier. So I would say overall, yes, we have a water crisis. It's spatially and temporally variable. It's going to increase with climate and urbanization, and the impacts are largely on the poor, and they're linked to other resources like food and energy, and because clean water is needed for adequate health, it's also needed to produce energy and to produce food, as we'll hear more about. And really, it's an extraordinary human rights issue. And I'll just end with Hillary Clinton. She actually says it best. Believe it or not, these are her words. The water crisis is a health crisis, it's a farming crisis, it's an economic crisis, it's a climate crisis, and increasingly it's a political crisis, and therefore we must have an equally comprehensive response.
Okay, well that's seems like a glass half full situation here from what I can tell.
Glass half full.
But maybe we can, or half empty, but maybe we'll get to the half full part.
You will.
We will, okay.
There's hope.
You mentioned the connection with climate, and let me turn it over to Kelly. Is there a climate crisis? I mean, I don't hear the word climate in this entire run-up to the presidential election anymore.
Yeah.
So yes, I thought maybe
it
was
disappeared,
over.
Right. Well, I thought you were going to ask me if there was an energy crisis, and I was going to say no. I mean, not depending on how you define the crisis. I don't think we're in any danger of running out of fuel. We may have certain fuels that are non-renewable that we're using and that someday will run out, but those are just likely to become more and more expensive, and not that we would actually totally run out of them. But I would say, to borrow a phrase from my mentor, John Holdren, we're running out of environment. As we use up all of these fossil fuels, we are exacting great damage on our physical environment, on our water supplies, air pollution, water pollution, and of course, climate change. And it is puzzling indeed why the sense of urgency about climate change has waned, but I think that's largely a US phenomenon. And when I go elsewhere in the world, I still detect a great sense of urgency. It's just in our current political context, I think we've lost that sense of urgency.
Okay. But say a little bit more about the fuel crisis or the lack thereof.
Well, I mean, another way to define the crisis, following on Rich, is that I would also say we have a crisis in terms of human access to energy. And, you know, there are well over 2 billion people also in the world without access to modern energy services. And so from the point of view of human well-being, that's a form of poverty. It's an energy poverty. Not having a light bulb by which you can read and study at night, not having access to refrigeration, or telecommunications, or any of those things. And so that, to me, is in fact a serious crisis as well.
So there's a crisis in distribution, but globally you feel that there is enough sources of energy.
Globally, there is.
Yeah.
You know, like water, fresh water, that is, energy's unequally distributed, and there are certain countries that feel very energy resource poor. I think Japan is an excellent example, and those national endowments strongly affect the energy policies of those countries, and a sense of crisis like Japan had even before the nuclear crisis there, strongly drove Japan to conserve energy, to pursue a path of nuclear power, this sense of resource insecurity. So I think for some countries, lack of natural endowment in terms of what's physically within their borders does feel like a crisis.
Mm-hmm. So it seems like the human condition is a little bit wobbly, either because of distribution problems or lack of a natural endowment. Let's turn to the human condition expert, Peter. First of all, if you look at it through the lens of nutrition and well-being, is there a crisis in nutrition?
Well, when you first asked me to do this, I thought, oh yeah, we want to sort of play up the crisis bit, this sort of gloom and doom. But I started thinking about it, and so if you sort of drill down into the data on this, does anybody here do any dieting, by the way? Right. Do you know roughly how many calories you have to eat a day to sort of tick over? How many? How many? 2,000 and something, right? It depends whether you're sedentary, whether you're running the marathon or what you're doing. So in the 1960s, if you divided all the food up by the number of people in the world, it's about 2,100 calories per person. Okay? So if you all sit still, you will survive. Or whatever it was, 4 billion. If you come to today, it's about 2,800 calories. And yet we have significantly more people. If you look at the projections for 2030, when we'll have not 6 billion, but 8 billion, we're talking about 3,000 calories per person, that we project is likely to be available. So that's sort of a good story, right? But the devil is in the details, right? So here's the next question. How long can you go without eating?
60 days.
Okay, 60 days, right? It depends how chubby you are. So, some of us take a bit longer to get rid of it all. So the biggest problem with food is you need a continuous supply. You basically, the market has to deliver all the time. And what we're discovering is that over the past 30 years, really since the Second World War, was 50 years, the way in which we conceive and use food around the world has just changed dramatically. I mean, that old sort of Walton's farm image of you grow the food and you eat it, which actually used to apply to most of the world, applies to hardly any of it now. Almost all the food people consume is now processed in some fashion. And almost all the food people consume is no longer just grown locally. So it's either marketed or the price is influenced by markets. So I've been in Ethiopia the last few weeks, came back on Sunday, and we're talking about another round of famine growing there. And 10 years ago, it was all about drought. Drought will stimulate the famine. What they're talking about now is food prices, global food prices. The fact that in like 2007, global food prices literally doubled in 1 year, and then the next year went back down again. And this year they're up to 2.5 what they were pre-2007. So effectively, the crisis is that we have created a global food system where what used to be seen as sort of a very deep connection between you and your food and sort of a right that you had has changed into a globalized commodity, and we're not very good at figuring out how to make that work in terms of supplying people continuously with the food they need. So you still have at one end of the curve something like 770 million people who don't have enough food to eat. And then at the other end of the curve, we've got a growing obesity crisis, which is fed by exactly the same problem. Our inability to figure out how do we make this new creation, this global way of dealing with food and food production, not only turn a profit, but also actually supply something which is pretty fundamental to survive. So there's a crisis, but it's a different type of crisis. It's not just about quantity, it's about how you make this intriguing system of economics and culture actually function to provide something that you actually can't do without, at least not for very long.
Fascinating. So it's quantity, economics, culture, quality of food as
Yeah.
well. Now you mentioned that food prices doubled and they went down, and essentially at the end of last year, actually food prices went down significantly.
Yeah, and now they're going back up again.
And what's the explanation for it
Oh, gosh.
not steadily going up? You know, it seems like the driver should be pointing in that direction now.
Well, it depends on what drives prices. Does anybody here do hedge funds? Right. So not all food is driven by supply and demand. Some food price hike is driven by speculation. What is going to happen? So are the Australians going to have another bad year? If they're going to have a bad year, is that going to put grain prices up? What's China going to do? Right, because China is switching from a country that basically used to eat vegetables to a country that's eating meat. It takes about 7 kilograms of grain to produce 1 kilogram of meat. So you do the maths, right? It's nice, but it's not very efficient. So if you have a nation that's a quarter of the world that is starting to switch over to meat, just project what that's likely to do to demand. Or think about the amount of grain land that's been taken out to produce ethanol, right? So where am I going to get my biggest bang for my buck? Do I sell grain to produce food, or do I sell grain to produce ethanol? And it's not something you can flip on, because the actual variety used for ethanol is different from the variety used for eating. So you can't just change in one season. So there are a lot of factors that go into affect the food price. Yeah.
And if I could just jump in, I mean, I think climate change is an interesting factor here. I mean, the Russian drought,
Yeah.
2 years ago now, am I right? 2 years ago, wiped out the whole wheat crop, as I recall.
Yeah.
And those sorts of things, are starting to happen with increasing frequency and strongly affecting, year-to-year variations, I think.
And it never used to be so pervasive, because essentially the world economy wasn't so integrated.
Yeah.
And it just fascinates me that I can be in a village in the absolute back of beyond, where you've had to walk for 2 days to get into this place, and you're talking with a local farmer who is asking you about what's happening to world grain prices. Because a generation ago, he was not connected with it. The economy was disaggregated, and he would basically sell in that valley.
Right.
But now the price he gets is affected by this outside trading. And that's just a radical change. And it's not good or bad, but it's something we've got to figure out, how do we deal with it, right? How do we make an economy work that actually supplies sufficient food for everybody, because it can. There's enough to do that. Allows us to make a profit, and somehow stops these fluctuations in the system. It's almost like wobbles in a complex system, isn't it? Yeah.
So Rich, as you're listening to this conversation, water is the almost the common currency that flows through all of this. What's the kind of the hydrologist in you thinking about potential solutions, potential ways to at least manage the availability of water, to the extent that water is a key driver behind many of the scarcities and challenges that both Kelly and Peter talked about?
Well, there are an awful lot of similarities first among the three resources, and their interconnection is really profound, actually. How food is water is a driver for food, but it's also a driver in some sense for energy. There are places where energy use, for example, in South India, 40% of the energy is used just to pump groundwater for irrigation, mostly for agriculture, which is the largest water user. Some of the things to think about are in general, a resource crisis is created by, the mismatch between the demand and the supply, and so everything that we can think about, and I'm here in an audience that knows probably a lot more about, forecasting both demand and supply, and in any sector it would be very similar. So I would say one of the most fundamental things we can learn from regarding water is that we can learn from other sectors, like the energy sector. For example, there are all sorts of efficiency gains that are being that have been realized in the energy sector around demand management, around smart grids, around all kinds of novel ideas that can be stolen basically from sectors which have been thinking about this a lot longer. I mean, the issue is really common. It's distribution. We talked about it with energy. It's the same with water. The problem is water is a lot heavier than food or energy. Energy can be sent, so food is so one of the novel features about water is not only that it's different because it's much heavier and it's hard to transport, but there's this option of virtual water, embedded water. So we talk about water embedded in crops and any product, and the idea is that if the Middle East is short on water, we can send them crops instead. So there's a host of virtual water trades that a great promise in that I would say in that area. I would just end on one other note, and this is in the water area there's a realization. There's two kinds of water. Okay, there's green water and blue water, and by that I don't mean what you think about green. Green is vertical flux transfer of water. It's the water that is embedded in the soil that evaporates and ends up in the sky. It's rainfall. Blue water is the stuff that people like me have been thinking about for centuries. Engineers have been moving blue water. It's the water you see. It's rivers, lakes, and so forth. But what we've noticed is that most of the water is tied up as green water. In other words, in places where the stresses are greatest, we did a study in Africa. We found where the greatest stresses where there was they had the most green water availability. So the notion of how to solve this problem, there are whole new ways of thinking about water in terms of green water management. Literally managing, evaporation is evil. Right? Evaporation is evil because it just transfers the water back to the atmosphere without any productivity. It doesn't produce carbon, it doesn't produce food, it doesn't. So the idea is to think about water very differently in terms of water management, and there are many ideas along those lines that might prove useful.
So by green water, you wouldn't include this, right? So,
no, that's not.
Okay, right.
That would.
Just checking.
Can I just jump in for a second? Because I think we have a doctoral student who just defended today, Ned Spang, and he was focusing on the water energy nexus, primarily looking at water consumption for energy. So how much water do we consume to produce different forms of energy? And he did a terrific dissertation, but to Rich's point directly, and one thing we talked about during his defense today is that often when we think about energy decisions, we don't consider the water consequences. So a great example here in the United States was our ethanol mandate in the Energy Policy Act of 2005, where we established this gigantic mandate for ethanol. If I remember off the top of my head, 36 billion gallons, is that correct? Million or billion, I'm not sure. Anyway, and lo and behold, according to Ned's calculations, that biofuel demand is now driving, it accounts for almost all of U.S. water consumption for energy. Did anyone even think about that? I don't recall any discussions of the water consequences of the ethanol mandate during that discussion. But it's had a profound effect on U.S. water consumption.
Well, many of those decisions are also, they're significant political considerations rather than economic or scientific.
Sure,
or
but I
policy
mean, I think,
considerations.
you know, the debate then
Yeah.
was how are we going to enhance energy security?
Sure.
Of course, there was a political consideration in terms of ethanol production and where that occurs. But, you know, arguably that didn't substantially enhance energy security, and it had this profound impact on water
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's, you know, it's interesting.
and on
on
food.
food, yeah.
Absolutely, on food
and
markets.
we see in so many countries
Yeah.
this notion of energy security we have here. Many other countries now are talking about food security and seeing it as part of a national agenda. I mean, my first job when I graduated in the early 1980s was helping Colonel Gaddafi turn the desert green, putting in those big central Pyrrhus irrigation systems. You see? And, you know, he had just part of his national policy was we have to grow enough food. Doesn't matter how much it costs. And, you know, if you've got enough money, you can do just about anything. And he was using fossil water, totally unsustainable for food security. And the same mentality still goes on today. So one of the most interesting twists we've seen in the food debate in the last 10 years has been watching the best arable land in Africa being bought up by food corporations and mostly Middle Eastern countries in order to grow their food on African soil and export it. So effectively, it's another round of colonialization, only for food security. And, you know, it's profitable for the people who have that land, but ultimately those countries that are now effectively losing territory are going to be in a real problem a few years down the line. And when we look at the systems, the other thing you talked about was this notion of efficiency and improving efficiency. And if we look at why we managed to increase food production over the last, well, since 1940s, almost all of it's been through increasing yield. In other words, how many tons per hectare or how many tons per acre we got. There's not more land to bring in production, very little of that. And there's not much more we can do with yield now, unless you get some really, really big advances in genetics, right? But something like probably less than half the food we produce actually gets eaten. In other words, the wastage in the system is monumental. It's somewhere between 50 and 60% of all food gets wasted. Because we store it on the farm and we lose food stored on the farm. We lose it in transportation. We lose it, well, the conversion to meat loses a bit. But for me, the changes in the next generation in terms of securing food is going to have to be in that efficiency area, because it's sort of a quick win, you know. Genetics is going to take time and may not produce crops that, well, particularly for the markets where food is needed, because they aren't actually high demand markets, so they're unlikely to be able to invest in the research. But improving efficiency and then dealing with these bizarre consequences of food security as they come along. I mean, nobody predicted a second African land grab. It's just sort of crept up without anybody realizing it. So again, it's back to this notion of these complex systems we've created, and we almost have to manage them half a step ahead of what the system's doing, right?
Yeah. So, Peter, you mentioned the role of China very briefly in sort of accelerating, you know, many of the challenges and imperatives that we see, you know, sort of cutting across all the resources. But you were referring to food in particular, but we certainly know that the rise of China in particular and the other emerging markets is contributing to the kind of the demand side pressure on water and energy and environmental quality. I was in China last week and you know, saw just a little bit of some of the kind of remarkable policy transformations, both within China and some of the things that they're implementing out there. And some of it is just, it's kind of boggles the mind, where they're moving entire rivers, shifting directions to feed the major cities away from certain parts of the country. And then there are entrepreneurs. I traveled with some entrepreneurs to the foot of the Great Wall, where they're planting willow trees to sort of capture water, and then they're going to use it to use the area to develop organic farms, to encourage local farming and so on, to address some of the concerns that you were talking about, Peter. China is contributing to the demand side pressure, but China, for its own interests, is also looking 2 steps ahead. In fact, it seems to be much more far-sighted than the US government or policymakers in practically any other part of the world. And so I'm wondering, Kelly, a large part of your research and field experience is in China. Are there any particular insights that you have picked up in your research on China as they have been exploring alternatives, energy sources, as they are thinking about their own policies for environmental security? Are there any learnings from what they are doing that are applicable to the US, to other emerging markets?
Big question,
Yeah.
big country. Well, I think of China as one gigantic paradox, or as Chairman Mao used to say, lots of internal contradictions. So, on the one hand now, China is the largest coal producer, largest coal consumer, largest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions. On the other hand, it also has the largest renewable energy capacity in the world. And as you were sort of alluding to, it's really taken a leadership position in a lot of our new renewable energy technologies. And this is sort of a controversial topic, which I'm happy to return to in the Q&A, but I've been working on a book, as you know, on the development of some of these industries in China. And, I think it's fair to say that the Chinese investments and kind of consistent and coherent broad-based support for solar and wind has helped to bring the cost of those technologies down dramatically by a factor of 3 in the case of solar energy, which has wonderful benefits for everybody who consumes, solar PV modules or wind turbines. I mean, the rest of us benefit greatly from cheaper, access to cleaner energy technologies. So I think, but then at the same time, as you probably noticed, there's horrible urban air pollution. I think 16 of the top 20 most polluted cities in the world are in China. They have tremendous problems with enforcement of regulations, but yet it's a place with tremendous energy and, energy in the sense of kind of a drive to find solutions, make a difference, and a lot of entrepreneurial activity going on there. So I feel very hopeful about China. I worry about timing. I think the central government leadership very much understands all of these challenges. They worry a lot about food security. They gave up a few years ago, I can't remember exactly when, on self-sufficiency in food. That was a long-held, almost had become cultural. And I think they're deeply worried about water. In fact, I think their worry about water is what drives their worry about climate change, because they're so worried about the decline of freshwater supply from the Tibetan Plateau. So I think the central government understands many of these challenges very well, and they're trying to experiment with different ways of approaching these issues and how to enforce the policies that they set forth.
Mm-hmm. So there are clearly some benefits that we are seeing from the extremely focused approach of, certainly led by the Chinese central government and then the broader entrepreneurial community around it. And there's a lot of talk in the press about the negative aspects of it and the unintended consequences of it. But you talked about some of the positive aspects, which is that it has brought down prices, in the solar industry in particular. Rich, Peter, do you see positive outcomes of the Chinese global strategy, not just within China, but say in Africa, in Latin America? Do you see positives in your own domains?
Well, I suppose in Africa, I mean, China's now the biggest investor in Africa, right? And if you've been going there for many years, as I have, it just fascinates me that, so stuck in a traffic jam in Addis Ababa last week because there's a new dual carriageway going in, and the guys driving the trucks, they are all Chinese. And it's Chinese companies that are putting the road network in, right? Talking with an Ethiopian entrepreneur about what he's investing in sesame seeds. Why? China wants to buy up the entire possible production of Ethiopia in sesame seeds. They want to lock it up. They want people to move away from growing whatever you're growing, grow sesame seeds, we need it. So you've got this dual notion of China as a nation that needs to secure resources and is extraordinarily pragmatic about how to do it. We need resources, therefore we'll do a deal. That's really what it boils down to. And we need markets. And so we are going to sell you our... So you can now buy Chinese cars in Africa that you couldn't buy 5 years ago. So where's it going to go? I'm not sure. And when you talk with colleagues, actually Tufts alumni who are in governments in Africa, they're not sure. They don't know whether they're getting into bed with a tiger or what's going to happen, because this relationship is completely different to the relationship they've had with previous investors, to the sort of relationship with the West, where there's always been these strings about, are you going to improve democracy or human rights? No such strings with China. It's quite bizarre. It's the most straight set of business deals that you will ever see. And they're saying, this is Chairman Mao? No, this is China, right? It's business deals. Very different.
Rich?
Yeah, I can really relate to a few things that Kelly said about energy, and I wasn't aware of those. And in China, it's really a paradox. I mean, they take the Three Gorges Dam, right? The Three Gorges Dam is one of the largest dam in the world. Basically, it's in pounds displaced over 3 million people. It generates. At the time, it was constructed almost a third of China's electricity. It was a macroeconomic event. And the evaluations and discussions of that project for decades were very critical on many aspects. And yet, when you look very closely at it, you find that this dam was considered in the middle of the 1800s. The planning began in the mid-1800s, and the plan was to move water to northern China. And these are things that haven't been in the conversation. I mean, when we talk about all the I'm not in favor or disfavor of that dam. The point being that it's extremely complex. Some of the issues that go on. I was involved with the Hai River Basin, and it feeds. It's one of the largest basins in China that feeds the mouth of the river ends in Beijing. And this river basin, interestingly, they were using some of the most advanced remote sensing techniques to manage evapotranspiration in the upland regions. I mean, stuff that we're not even doing. And yet, at the same time, they came to us. We had a workshop at Tufts. I run a program in Water System Science and Society. We do a lot of integrated work. They came to us asking, gee, how much should we charge for the water that we sell to northern China, because their economic system hasn't yet come to grips with the balance of demand and supply and the economic and treating water as a good. They were just thinking, gee, how much does it cost to move the water, which of course is just a fraction of the real cost, or the true cost of that water and the value of that water. And I could use so many examples. It's so in another example that puts them on par with us. I mean, just like our Colorado River ends up in Mexico dry because of poor water policy at the turn of the 19th century. and we end up with a desalination plant at the mouth of the Colorado, where, well, actually at the confluence where it meets Mexico. They have the same problem. One of their largest, the Yangtze River is practically dry. I mean, this is one of the largest rivers in the world, and these are crises in the making, basically due to withdrawals, human water withdrawals. We've changed literally the whole hydrology, the hydrologic cycle of many of these basins doesn't look anything like what Mother Nature gave us a long time ago. Most of the water is moving through human systems now and is embedded actually in human systems. And they're a great example.
These are such fascinating issues, and I just want to take a half a minute for a quick commercial break. You don't get anything for free. So the quick commercial break is about what we're trying to do at the Fletcher School. And at Fletcher, which as all of you know, is the oldest exclusively graduate school in international affairs in the country. And Fletcher's purpose is to examine issues that are the most significant problems on the global stage. Try to understand what the underlying causes of those problems are, and then try to produce the next generation of leaders who will come up with solutions to those problems. And the solutions to those problems cannot draw upon a single community. It really needs to bring together the thought leaders, several of whom are on the stage, people from the private sector, investors, entrepreneurs, technologists, business people, people in the policy arena, and people in the social sector, folks who work at the grassroots level and folks who work in multilateral agencies. Over the course of the last year, we founded an institute called the Institute for Business in the Global Context, which houses a new degree at Fletcher, the Master of International Business, which blends a classic business education with a classic Fletcher International Affairs education. As part of the work of this institute, one of the activities that a group of our students engaged in was imagining what the world would look like 10 years from now. And this group of students produced an issue of The Economist magazine for the year February 2022. And many of the stories that showed up in the lead of this Economist magazine just was a reflection of exactly this conversation. And a lot of that work sort of drew upon brainstorming and research that the students had done of what were the fundamental trends that were going to shape civilization and the global society. And it's pretty clear that no matter where you turn to a thoughtful discussion of these underlying drivers, it does come back to the issues of food, water, and fuel. And so it's a real privilege to have all of you here, and we hope that in our next gathering of a student team that comes up with the April issue of The Economist magazine for the year 2022, we'll be able to interview you for some of those articles and have you quoted for the future. But before we do that, I'd like to now take the opportunity to invite the audience for questions and see if there are some burning issues that you'd like to put to our experts. The gentleman back there, if you don't mind just identifying yourself and your
Is this
your
on?
background. Yeah.
I'm John Howe. I'm Fletcher class of '84. So I came of age in the 60s when Paul Ehrlich's population bomb was kind of part of the background of the culture. Somehow during the 70s, the topic of population became taboo. And for 40 years, it seems to have been all of you mentioned it obliquely, it's kind of the independent variable. Will the topic of population resume center stage? Any problem that we can solve with 7 billion people may still be insoluble with 10 or 12 billion people. So I'd be interested in your views.
Should we start with the disaster person right here?
Thanks. Right. Okay, well, there's a couple of stories, I think, in this. I think you're right. It's amazing how some of these topics people just don't want to talk about, right? So there's two bits to the population thing. The first is that the overall rate of growth is slackening off, right? So we're not growing as fast as a globe as we were previously. And you can project that curve, and there are error factors, but 9 billion, 10 billion people, and it may start to level off. Okay? So you've got to look at why. Why does that come down, and where's it not coming down? Where it's not coming down is mostly in the developing south. And if we go back in history and we look at why did it start to come down in the north, it's essentially about the difference between how many people are being born and how many people are dying. It's like any population, right? If you have more people being born and fewer people dying, it grows. And the really determining factor is fertility rate. How many children are you willing to have? What happened in the West was essentially, as we got better at medicine, as we introduced antibiotics, or actually as we introduced better sanitation, which was the real kicker that prolonged people's lives, this happened over 50, 100 years, and the size of families changed. People started having smaller families because it made more economic sense. The trouble in most southern states, southern countries, is that the speed with which you've moved from as we were in the 1700s to as we are now, rather than being 100 years, has been in 30 years, with the introduction of better sanitation, better healthcare systems, and effectively the rate of the fertility rate has not gone down at the same pace. And so effectively you've therefore got a growing population. Now there are signs that in many middle-income countries, it is declining. You've still got you've got a problem with sub-Saharan Africa, an area of the world which 1980 was food self-sufficient, now is only producing about 80% of its food, and has growth rates that's still in the 2% population. 2% is a big increase per year, right? So it's a matter of differentiating it down. I would say the real issue is how do you take those countries that are in the bottom third of the economy of the world and start to get the fertility rate to come down to where it is in the others. If you can do that, then you'll have a population that's manageable.
So for your reference, those of you who have less than 2.1 children, you're keeping the population down. If you have more than 2.1, then you're actually adding to our 7 billion. And if you live in a developing country, if you have more than 2.3.
You're trying to make people feel guilty.
What's that? Any
Well,
comments,
I would
Kelly?
just say, I think that Ehrlich was brilliant in understanding, I mean, although the bomb, maybe hasn't come to fruition, he was brilliant in understanding the fundamental role that population plays in terms of any kind of impact you can think of. And he's very famous for this iPad equation, and I'm looking at some of my former students, and I won't call on them. But the equation was that any impact is a function of population, affluence, which we typically measure as per capita GDP, and then technology. So in the energy space, we often use an energy intensity metric, the amount of energy you're using per unit of GDP. And it's a great tool to use in the classroom and in the real world because that gives you a nice set of options. So what are we going to do if we want to reduce the impact of something? We can reduce population, but that's not a palatable topic anywhere except maybe in China. And even in China, that's a difficult topic, a controversial topic, of course. Affluence, who wants to tell someone they should get poorer or that there should be less economic growth? And then that leads us to technology, and that's almost misleading in the sense that it isn't just simply a function of, having cleaner technologies, but, using them. So to me, he was spot on. Population is a huge driver, and it's one of the things that I think is hardest to deal with, and that hasn't changed.
Let's take a question. I think you had a question.
Could I just comment on one aspect? Because this is something that, how many of you live in a town where you thought you got several 100-year floods in a row recently?
Several what?
100-year floods in a row. This is all about population growth, you see. What it is it's a complete mistake. we're not getting more 100-year floods. What's happening in these urbanizing areas of the United States, I did a study in which we showed that in the urbanizing area where population has increased over time, the magnification of floods has increased dramatically in comparison to climate change. Climate change pales the effects on floods compared to growth, literally construction of impervious surfaces. That's for floods, and that's well known. It was also a recent study in Africa that showed that that most of the human damages from floods arise from urbanization, from population growth, rather than from climate. And not to say climate's not important in the change, but on the other side of the coin, you have drought. Now, drought's far more complex, and it's used to be just you could predict whether how much water people needed just by how many people there were. Of course, now with conservation and new technologies, population growth and water demand are not really very well correlated. On the one hand, on the other hand, I mean, there's no way around the solution of water crises without thinking about how we're going to serve this population and increase the fertility rate and so forth. And the only way we're going to get there, in my opinion, is through small scale, at source, point of source treatment. Point of use treatment. So there's all these new technologies that are, innovative technology, very low tech things, how to filter water when you use it to get clean water where you have it. And this is a tremendous growth area. You're going to hear all kinds of things about this in the future. I'm so amazed that the universities and the researchers have not addressed this issue. It's a humanitarian issue. It's really one of these things I just can't quite understand why we haven't done anything about it. But it's all about population.
Just like those straws that are being distributed in many parts of the developing.
Straws, very simple filters, very more complex systems that actually do treatment for larger households.
Right. Okay. Please.
Hi, Regina Frawley, Fletcher 80. Back in the day, I remember the case studies talking about negotiating.
It's probably on, I think.
Negotiating with different countries, especially Africa, for example, for natural resources. And usually, depending on the power of the government, there were better deals on behalf of their government, and sometimes there were better deals on behalf of a few people. But it wasn't just the ability in the 60s, 70s, 80s as easily to push a way in and make it just be for the multinational. That said, you intrigued me when you talked about how China negotiates. Can you elaborate on their paradigm, number one, and number two, is there a difference from country to country, say just in Africa?
Okay, so I suppose a couple of issues worth picking up on. What intrigues me about watching the way China operates is just how darn pragmatic it is. You can see that it's about the resources, and it's this sense of time scale, right? That what they're trying to do, I think, is construct a series of relationships which will last, and a series of deals that will last. It's not about an election cycle. It's not an election cycle. It's not, we'll do this for the next 5 years, but then somebody else is going to be in power. It's what do we need to do in order to get through the next 100 years? And it's a different mindset. And if you look back through Chinese history, you see that mindset, that ability to plan long term, to think much longer term than we typically do in our businesses. I think that's part of it. The other thing that comes out is you're asking variance across countries. One of the things we've been looking at, people looking at, is what actually allows a country to become less violent, to have better human rights, to have more secure food supplies, in other words, to be a nicer place to live. And the single biggest correlative factor across it is good governance. Countries where actually you have a government that has a sense of responsibility, and it doesn't have to be elected necessarily, but there's a relationship between people and government. And one of the things we discover is that the countries that have the hardest time reaching that stage are countries with large amounts of natural resources to sell. Because basically you could make your country run just by selling your oil. You don't actually have to be accountable to your people. So you'd think You know, Zaire having all of this cobalt and all the other minerals was, oh, well, not Democratic Republic of the Congo now. You'd think it was a great thing. It absolutely isn't. It actually creates a less democratic country and a less sustainable country. So you have this dilemma that quite often these natural resource deals are good for a few families, and some of them get extraordinarily rich out of it, but actually are quite bad for the country as a whole. And you can see this debate playing out in a country like Ethiopia now, where they're saying, you know, are we right to be selling our natural resources to China en masse and tying these deals up via government contracts? Which, little example. So, Ethiopia used to have the best telecommunications system in Africa in the 1980s. Way better than anybody else in the continent, apart from South Africa. It's now one of the worst. It's probably the only telecom system in Africa that hasn't privatized in any fashion whatsoever. It's run by the government, it's controlled by the government. It was about to privatize and start privatizing a year ago. China's just pumped $2 billion into the telecommunications infrastructure, so the government doesn't have to privatize. It doesn't have to open up the market. It doesn't have to bring people into the discussion about what do you want, because they can say, oh, it's working now, right? So it's a complicated relationship.
So Mike, right me.
Roger Falcon with Fletcher class of '99. Following up, as a follow-up question onto that, one of my great interests is corruption, and this is an instance of potential corruption. One of the things that didn't come out was corruption. If we talk about China, it may have a long-term perspective on one hand. On the other hand, you have whole ghost cities being built, because why? Because it's the fastest resource you can flip, and if you can get it off to someone else, and when it's built, you don't have the risk of the mafia coming and taking you out. So right now in China, we have whole cities being built for that, and that's going to have a cost. How else do you see corruption playing out in this complex relationship that you've been describing in the different sectors?
Rich, do you have a perspective?
I don't think I have a too informed a perspective. I can't help but think of the situation in Mumbai, where you have these unauthorized citizens living in the outskirts of the, and this is happening in many urbanizing area, where you have a central water supply for the urban area, but then these illegal residents have no water. And so there's tremendous amount of corruption involved in trying to, literally make illegal connections. There's literally a whole culture and an entire culture that surrounds the problem of these illegal connections. More broadly, the idea of corruption in water. Again, being an engineer, I'm not as versed in policy matters of this kind and don't have as broad I don't have anything. I'd rather turn it to the others.
There's a fabulous book actually just on the problem in Mumbai and corruption, written by Catherine Boo, called Behind the Beautiful Forevers. Strongly recommend that to anybody who's interested in at least reading about that aspect of it in the region that Rich was talking about. Kelly, Peter, your comments?
It's back to the governance issue. Corruption is just a spin on bad governance, right? Systems that allow, so corruption, well, how does Transparency International define it? The abuse of power for personal gain, right? Well, that sounds pretty much like what most autocrats do, right? So it's about that issue. It's about poor governance and the ability of people to use a system not for the good of all, but just for their personal power. I mean, it's interesting that some of the African states are now starting to stamp down on it, because the evidence is so clear that you are not going to move your country forward if you have high levels of corruption. And it's not just the democratic ones, even the more sort of autocratic states are now starting to find ways of at least showcasing the worst excesses. One of the intriguing things, though, that I find is trying to figure out where corruption ends and where cultural practice starts, right? So in many societies, it's a good thing to get a job for your son and your uncle. but in Germany it's not. I mean, that's corruption in Germany, that's nepotism, right? So we're here in the United States. So there's quite a lot of debate goes on, and we have this in most of the states where we do our research. At what point is it accepted local practice, and what point it's corrupt? And we always come back to this, do you see this? Do you feel this as an abuse of power? If you feel it as an abuse of power, then it's corrupt. And it goes along with bad governance, it goes along with the inability of people to have voice in their country. If you can tackle that, then you're well on the way to making a sustainable country.
Well, the specific example that you cited of real estate, kind of rampant overbuilding of buildings, commercial and residential. It's not just limited to China, it's happening in practically every one of the major emerging markets. And a lot of that is kind of resting on a foundation of corruption. That overbuilding is contributing to water problems because of the urban congestion that Rich was talking about, certainly contributing to the air quality problems that Kelly was talking about. And of course, it all ties back into food and all the food issues. So it's central, and it's unclear how anybody can reverse that trend, because it seems to be happening, practically as a corollary of the fast growth that the fast-growing parts of the world seem to be experiencing. Wondering if there are other voices back here. How about the lady in the back row right there?
Hi, Karen Chamberlain, Fletcher 99. Just thinking to Boston, and we recently had our own energy crisis with a snowstorm in October, a water crisis where people ran to the store and bought water when all they really needed to do was boil their water. And with the energy loss in October, people lost 2 freezerfuls of food from Costco. So how do we adjust our own personal expectations and adjust our survival instincts when we become so urbanized and accustomed to these resources that are so free and cheap and readily available that when they become unavailable, we kind of hit crisis mode?
Who wants to take that?
Well, it's classic disaster preparedness, really. Rich touched on it already. One of the intriguing things about the way we've created our world is we have built very complicated, interconnected systems, right? And in some ways, those can be very stable. So if we take, for instance, Walmart's logistics system. Walmart is a logistics company. They just happen to have grocery chains at the end. But they're basically a logistics system. Extraordinarily complicated system. It just honed to perfection. It's just a joy to watch how it works. Their ability to control that system. However, when it breaks down, you get the effects you're seeing. So one of the things people are now starting to push is this notion of can you, instead of having one large integrated, can you have much smaller systems so that, for instance, your food supply is much closer to where you're eating it, but you're still getting information from other systems to trade. So you can take that down to your own household level and say, well, where's your preparedness? I've been brought up in the disaster response business. I'm probably a disaster freak. I actually keep a stock of water in the cellar, and I've got my food, and it's awful, it's like a complete nerd. But then I feel quite smug when the electricity goes out, and I've got that light I can use, and I've got the water, and I've got the food. And I think in many ways that's the sort of thing we probably need to be thinking about, because all the predictions we say that you are going to see more crises simply because of the speed with which our systems are changing and our inability to adapt our social structures and our political structures to keep up with those changes. And like in any evolutionary system, if you don't keep up adaptation, what you get are crises. And so you've almost got to model the way you construct your business or your industry or your life to say crises are going to become much more normal.
Yep.
And so I'm going to have to be able to figure out, how do I survive 2 days without electricity, what I put in the house? How does my business survive without a computer server for a week? Right? That's, I think, going to be a different way of thinking over the next generation.
I would argue we're really just beginning to understand these complex systems. I mean, Walmart is a great example. I think about this when I drive a Privia. You know, the system is so complex and yet it's so beautifully designed. It's a masterpiece. But when you start thinking about a water system, how did Katrina happen? I mean, Katrina happened because of governmental lapses and all sorts of social and political issues, but it also lapsed because we had a huge hurricane meet a river. And you know, river engineers, they work on rivers, and coastal engineers work on coast, and they don't ever put the two together. Nobody ever really thought about what would happen if you had both those things at the same time. The same thing happens with these three resources. We're just beginning to think about this. And I saw a movie recently, which you'll all hear about, because it's sort of the Al Gore movie for climate change, is about the last call at the Oasis is made by the same producer and is about to be released on May 4th. I saw it at a pre-screening. And I was really disappointed because what they talk about all the things you've heard about and you've read about, but they didn't talk about what you don't hear about. Water management, the hidden behind the scenes, what goes on in water management. I want to make a movie that talks about the crises that could happen, that is possible. I don't want to talk about terrorism because I don't want to give them good ideas, but we could do that as well. But I want to make a movie where, you know, a dam breaches because of a earthquake liquefaction event, and then yes, of course, we've seen that movie before, all the breach that occurs and the flood damages. But how about what happens in the aftermath when that water supply was perhaps the Hoover Dam, which is the sole source of water for a metropolitan area like Las Vegas, which, you know, is landlocked, let's say, and couldn't get water anywhere else. What's going to happen over the next, you know, 2 or 3 decades to provide water when it took 50 years for the Hoover Dam to fill? I mean, it was built in 1930. It didn't fill until 1985. I mean, and it's only been full a couple times since then, or actually about twice. So what I would argue is we haven't even really thought through some of the crises that are potential. And I'm not trying to be doom and gloom here because I actually don't think that way normally. But our systems are so complex that I really don't think we've really thought through what could be and how vulnerable we are. When I heard that question, I have to laugh because you think you're vulnerable? I mean, think about what could happen and where you could be living and the kinds of problems we could have. And that's not to denigrate the question. It was a great question because it brought up all these ideas.
So on that note and doom and gloom, I actually, with due respect to our experts here, I do want to provide a counterexample, which is that we actually don't have at all any scarcity of food, water, and fuel for further conversation. If you just step outside, because there's plenty of it. And what I would suggest is we transition to taking the discussion to the next room. I do want to kind of close out this part of the conversation, the more plenary formal part of the conversation, by asking each one of our panelists kind of one simple question. And in the spirit of projecting yourself into the future, I won't ask you to project 10 years out. I'll simply ask you to go to January 2013, and you've been called into the office of President Rick Santorum. And Kelly, you have to give him one good idea to finally get his mind wrapped around the question of energy and an opportunity.
Okay, no, that's actually easy because I was asked that before President Obama or right after he was elected, and my suggestion was that the United States should aim to become the most energy efficient country in the world, and by setting a clear metric in terms of energy efficiency, we would solve so many different, or not necessarily solve, but make great progress on many different issues, such as energy security, climate change, urban air pollution. Would actually do a lot for water, probably for food. I haven't thought about that. Certainly for food in terms of ethanol. So I think if I had to pick one thing, that's what I would pick.
And this is through pump priming by government subsidies?
Oh, now you're getting into how. I think there's a lot of different things that would need to be done. I mean, we don't price energy well. We don't reflect most of the, externalities, as we call them, in terms of national security and environment and health. And so forth. So I mean, personally, that would be my choice. Politically, that's probably the least palatable choice.
Rich, your pitch
Yep.
to President Rick?
Yep. I could say, bring water to all those poor people that don't have it. I could say that instead of bringing water, not just bringing water, but teaching them how to get their own water. I could say not only teaching them how to get their own water, but teaching them how to manage and secure fresh, clean water for their future generations. And if I said all that together, that's what we do at Tufts actually in this program, the Water System Science and Society program. We teach our students about all of that, and we actually do some of it. And so my dream would be that we could take a program like this and we could meld it with, the financial world as well as perhaps NGOs and donors that do this sort of, fundamental humanitarian work, and put it all together into a package, a sustainable package.
Peter, food crisis?
So did he get him with a landslide victory, or
It was a squeaker.
it was a speaker? Okay.
Yeah. But at that point, maybe the Supreme Court
So
stepped
he's
in and
interested in
decided.
the second term then, how he gets re-elected.
Yeah.
Well, so I suppose what I'd say to him is, you need to think of food, and you need to think of food security in the United States not just as a commercial system, because it's really at base. If you do not have a well-fed population, that means enough food and not too much. So if you have an obese population, that population does not function well. It's the scores in school go down, their ability to be creative goes down. It is a security, it's a national security problem. So somehow what you have got to do, you have got to be the first president who's able to square this circle of saying food is a right and food is a commercial resource. And if you can figure out as a president how to make a commercial system supply somebody's right, then you've actually figured out one of the biggest problems of states today, because it also applies to water, it applies to information, it applies to education. So if you can square that circle, how do you make profit out of supplying rights?
Great. I think we'll have a bright future ahead with President Rick Santorum going forward from January 2013.
As long as he's got the right
with these kinds of advisors. Well, it's been said that the future is already here. It's only that it's unevenly distributed. It seems like, from the very brief comments that we had an opportunity to share with our experts, there is a crisis depending on how you look at it. However, the kind of the glass half full version of it is, yes, there's a demand and supply imbalance, but there is a distribution problem, and if you can find the opportunities to match the supply to the demand and potentially find alternative sources of supply, and there are technologies available to help do that, we could address many parts of the problem. And there are some entrepreneurs, some governments, such as the government in China, that are taking some fairly deliberate steps towards resolving it, which suggests that for those of you who are in the investment community, in the business community, in the entrepreneurial or technology community, there is hope in terms of being able to create those right matches. On that note, I would ask you to join me in thanking our experts for a very stimulating conversation.